What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. So today's video is part 2 of the arts and crafts or mission style dining chair build. In part 1, if you missed it, we made the back legs, front legs, did all the stretchers and the joinery there. And in part 2, I'm going to do the back rests, which were really tricky. They're all very curved, so trying to get those all to match was a little bit of a trick, but got that working. Also going to do the back splat and then these side decorative styles. So also going to be finishing the piece, obviously, and getting it to its final state. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the build. The next step in the dining chair build was to start working on the backrests. So these were one of the more intimidating parts of the build for me, and I really put them off for way longer than I should have. So these backrests are made up of 8/4 stock and end up at about 1 inch thick once the curve is added to the pieces. So first I cut the back pieces to rough size of the table saw, squared up one face on the jointer, and then went ahead and cut my joinery using the Domino XL. It's critical to cut your joinery before adding the curves, since there won't really be a good reference surface after cutting the curves. So to start cutting the curves, I first rough cut them on the bandsaw, getting fairly close to my lines but not going over them. And it's a good idea to double check that your table is square to your blade before this step. Otherwise, you'll be really bummed out when it's time to route the pieces flush. Don't ask me how I know this. With the curves cut roughly, I clamped the piece into this quick jig I made to route the final curve. So the jig is just a piece of 3/4 inch plywood as the base, with a few toggle clamps added to hold the backrest in place. For this operation, this jig was used to cut the curve on the front of the backrest. So I made 3 passes on each side of the backrest to cut in this curve. First, I started with the bearing just above the surface so that the router bit didn't have to remove too much material. After that pass, I raised the bit higher and made another pass. And finally, I flipped the piece over in the jig and also added the top bearing to the router bit. On this final pass, the jig is only being used to stabilize the piece so it doesn't tip over, since the bearing is riding on the backrest where it's already been cut. After cutting the curves on the front of all the backrest pieces, I needed to adjust the jig so that it would work for the curve on the back of the pieces. I drew the curve onto the plywood base and also moved the blocks that held the toggle clamps to the other side of the jig. I cut roughly along the curve using the bandsaw, making sure to not go over my line. Finally, I shaped the curve using my oscillating belt sander, taking my time and sanding right up to the line. With the curve finalized, I could use it as a template to trace the curve onto the other side of the backrest, and then I used this line to cut away most of the excess on the bandsaw. You basically want to cut very close to your line without going over it to avoid putting too much strain on your router bit, and this will also help mitigate tear out. Next, I repeated the same steps as before at the router table, making 3 passes per side. And one note here is I made 2 passes on each backrest piece, then added the bearing, and then made the final pass on all the pieces. That way I didn't have to put the bearing on and take it off over and over again. With the backrest cut to shape, I cut the mortises into the corresponding places on the back legs using the Domino. And just for a point of reference, I'm using 8mm by 50mm dominoes for the backrests. Now that all the main pieces were in place on the chairs, I could start working on the spindles for the back splat, as well as the decorative spindles on the sides of the chair. I needed to wait until this point to work on these so that I could take exact measurements based on how the pieces came together on the chair. These spindles are 3/4 inch square, and I ripped them to rough size on the table saw and then brought them to final size using the planer. I cut them to final length at the miter saw, leaving an extra 1.5 inches of length for the integral tenons, which I'll cut in the next step. And before cutting the tenons, I sanded all of the faces using my drum sander, which makes really quick work of this. To start cutting the tenons into the spindles, I first needed to define the shoulders of the tenon using a standard blade before moving on to a dado stack to remove the rest of the material. To do this, I set up a block on my table saw fence, which would allow me to accurately cut the shoulder on all 4 sides of each spindle using my miter gauge. First, I pushed the spindle up against the block, made a pass, then rotated the spindle 90 degrees, made another pass, and repeated this until there was a consistent shoulder line on all 4 sides of the spindle. I then flipped the spindle over end for end and repeated these steps again. Now, as you can imagine, this process took a long time considering I had 40 spindles for the sides of the 4 chairs and 28 spindles for the backs. After all the shoulder lines were established, I swapped over to a 3/4 inch wide dado stack to remove the rest of the waste to create the tenon. Again, I needed to precisely set the blade height to get the proper tenon size, which was 3/8 of an inch in my case. The process for creating the tenon was the same as cutting the shoulder line, except that I stayed clear of the shoulder line when removing the waist. And splitting these two steps leaves you with a really clean tenon that goes together with no gaps. While I'm cutting the tenons, let's talk about one of the sponsors of this week's video, Powermatic, the gold standard. I upgraded to the Powermatic PJ882 helical head jointer and 15HH helical head planer right before starting this project, and it was a total game changer for my woodworking. The surface finish off these machines is absolutely amazing, and I know they'll last me for many, many years to come. Learn more about these machines by checking out the link in the video description below. With all the spindles finished, it was time to lay out the locations for the mortises which house the spindle tenons. The spindles on the sides of the chairs are centered along the chair's width and are spaced 3/4 of an inch between each spindle. I laid out the locations using my combination square and woodpecker's square. With the mortise locations laid out, I moved over to the hollow chisel mortiser to cut the mortises. I bought this tool specifically for this project and it was worth every penny. I had 136 of these mortises to cut and got them knocked out in about an hour using this little hollow chisel mortiser. And I just picked up this jet model used on Craigslist for about 200 bucks, and I'm really glad I did. Next, I laid out the mortises on the backrest using the same method as before. And to cut these mortises, I just made sure the backrest was flat up against the fence of the mortiser and cut the mortises to match my lines. With the mortises finished, I could move on to assembly of the chairs. First, I assembled the side stretchers and the spindles, and when assembling the spindles, I made sure to go fairly light on the glue to avoid as much squeeze out as possible, and I just wiped away any squeeze out with a damp rag. Next, I assembled the backrests and the back splat spindles in the same way as the side spindles. While these assemblies dried, I went ahead and started sanding some of the other pieces up to 120 grit, and it was a lot easier to sand these pieces prior to assembly than afterwards. Once the side stretcher assemblies had dried, I moved on to the next assembly, which was gluing up the back leg to the side stretchers and then finally adding the front leg. I really took my time on these glue ups and double and triple checked the orientation of all the pieces before driving them home. If any of these had ended up backwards, I would have been in pretty big trouble. Once these side assemblies dried, I went ahead and broke the edges on most of the pieces with 120 grit sandpaper on my random orbit sander. The final glue up wasn't really all that stressful considering I broke the glue up into stages. It involved connecting the front and back stretchers to the side assemblies as well as adding in the backrest assembly. While I'm gluing up the chair, let's talk about one of the sponsors of this week's video, the John C. Campbell Folk School. I recently had the opportunity to attend a week-long woodworking class at the school, and it was an amazing experience. John C. Campbell is located in Brasstown, North Carolina, about 2 hours from Atlanta, Knoxville, and Asheville, so it's centrally located to many places in the Southeast. They have classes on everything from woodworking to blacksmithing to drawing and much, much more. To learn more, visit their website at folkschool.org or check out the link in the video description below. The next day, I worked on the final pieces of the chairs. First, I needed to create these corner braces, which are used to attach the seat to the chair frame. I cut these to width on the miter saw from some scrap pieces of white oak I had. After they were cut to width, I cut a 45-degree bevel on one end, again on the miter saw. And next I brought the piece over to one of the chairs and marked the angle on the other end of the corner brace. These angles aren't 45 degrees due to the splay of the side stretchers, and it's really best to take this measurement off of the chair itself. The angle is also different for the front and back corner braces. I cut all 8 front corner braces, labeled them, and then added a pocket hole to the center of each corner brace. And finally, I attached the corner braces using 1¼ inch screws, pre-drilling first to avoid splitting. The final pieces on the chairs were these cross stretchers that connected to the inside of each lower side stretcher. Again, I just cut these on the miter saw, just marking the angle I needed and matching it on the miter saw. To attach it, I used 1¼ inch hardwood pocket screws, and as far as I can tell, these pieces aren't even necessary structurally, so these pocket screws should be plenty strong and they'll never be seen. To keep the piece in place while I added the screws, I added clamps, and this is one of the key factors in success when using pocket screws. Next, it was time to work on dialing in the color of the stain. After experimenting with a few different stains, I landed on a trans tint dye in the brown mahogany color. I began by diluting the stain in a 1 ounce to 1 quart ratio using a 50-50 mix of distilled water and denatured alcohol. This mix ended up too light for the color I was looking for, so I continued gradually adding dye until I got the color I wanted, which ended up at a ratio of about 2 ounces of dye to 1 quart of liquid. Before applying the stain, I sanded all the pieces up to 150 grit, making sure all the edges were broken and also making sure any dried glue was removed. On the first coat of stain, I applied it way too light, and this caused a few problems. First, the stain dried before I could wipe up any drips, which ended up leaving drip marks on areas of the chair. Second, the color was much lighter than when I had applied the stain to my test boards. After the first chair didn't go so well, I put up an Instagram story asking my followers for advice and got some great responses. Big shout out to Freddie Roman at @craftsman on Instagram and Brian Prusa at Prusa Woodworks on Instagram. They both suggested that I basically slop on the stain, which helped to ensure that it stayed wet longer. This gave me time to wipe away any excess stain before it dried. It was also much easier to get into the corners and other small areas in the chair. While the stain dried, I worked on the chair seats. These are modeled identically off of the original chair and are just cut out of 1/2-inch plywood. These chairs will be professionally upholstered, so I just needed to cut out the frames. I used my bandsaw to cut out the outside shape, staying as close to the line as possible. To cut the inside edges, I used my jigsaw. First, I drilled a pilot hole using a 1/2-inch drill bit and then followed my lines with the jigsaw. Off camera, I also sanded the edges slightly, although this probably wasn't even necessary. Once the stain dried for a few hours, it was time to apply the clear coat. I used General Finishes in Durovar, one of my favorite water-based finishes. It sprays really easily, dries in about an hour since it's a water-based finish, and gives the piece a nice amber color similar to an oil-based finish. I also want to shout out my Fuji Q3 HVLP system. It's an absolutely awesome system and has a ton of adjustability. I was able to apply a coat to each of these chairs in about 20 minutes and had 3 coats applied in an afternoon. I sanded with 400 grit sandpaper between coats and ended up with an awesome looking finish. One other tip when spraying finish is to add screws in the bottom of the legs of whatever you're working on so the piece is lifted off the ground. After the finish was applied, I removed the screws from the bottom of the legs, added some felt pads, and the chairs were finished. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was, as I've said before, one of the most difficult woodworking projects I have ever done, but I'm really happy with the way these came out. I mean, I think the color is beautiful. This quarter sawn white oak with all these ray flecks popping out is just gorgeous. Really kind of fits that arts and crafts mission style. The color isn't an absolute perfect match for the chair that I was trying to match, but I think it is very, very close, and definitely close enough to have them side by side in the dining room. So I'm gonna get some final beauty shots here at the end for you guys to check out. Really excited with how these turned out. And again, I do have a free SketchUp model of this chair on my website. I didn't do plans, just too many measurements were taken off the original chair to do that, but that link to the SketchUp file is in the video description below if you're interested. Thanks again for watching. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If you don't already, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this every Tuesday. Also, I have a list of all the materials and tools I used in the video description below. And last, I want to say a huge shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. You guys are awesome. I'll have a list of my $10 and up patrons here at the bottom of the screen. All right, thanks again for watching, guys, and until next week, happy building.